Karen Collins.
Sorry. Okay.
I'm Karen Collins. I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist, and I serve as nutrition advisor to the American Institute for Cancer Research. And tonight, we're going to focus specifically not just on all aspects of nutrition related to your health, but honing in on the questions about metabolic syndrome, why it matters, and what you can do. And I think that this will actually fill in a lot of the gaps and round out some of the picture of discussions that you had last week with Dr. Berger looking at sarcopenia. So I'm going to go through quite a bit of groundwork, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. I will ask you to hold your questions until that Q&A section, because I think the concepts that we're going to build throughout our time together will sort of build on one another, and things that aren't completely clear will probably get a little bit clearer as we go along, or at least hopefully so. Today, we will aim to do three things. One, for you to develop an understanding of what metabolic syndrome is and why it's even of concern, both for general health and after a cancer diagnosis. We'll identify some of the strategies that you can incorporate in your eating habits and lifestyle to avoid or reverse metabolic syndrome. And we'll hopefully have you discover how some strategies to address metabolic syndrome fit with choices that reduce risk of sarcopenia that you were hearing about last week, and both as an overall diet and lifestyle to promote overall health and well-being. So let's get started and zoom in on what metabolic syndrome is. Metabolic syndrome is defined by the presence of three or more of the following factors, whether currently high or being treated for: high blood sugar, high blood pressure, high blood triglycerides, a low HDL cholesterol, sometimes called the good cholesterol, or an elevated waist circumference. Now, precise definitions have changed a little bit over the years, but most authorities now refer to this, the criteria as you see them listed here. That was a harmonized consensus developed by major international organizations together. The biggest variation among the criteria involves waist size. Some definitions use actually a tighter, a lower cutoff point for waist circumference, with the based on some evidence that it even lower than that, it starts to identify people who have increased risk. And for people of Asian ancestry, there are separate lower cutoffs because there's a genetic tendency for more of the storage of body fat to be in what's called visceral fat at any given waist size. And we'll come back to that concept about just visceral fat. And there are, just so you know, other ethnicity-based thresholds for waist size being developed. But these are the five components that are what make up or define metabolic syndrome. So the funny thing about, or not so funny, but unfortunate thing, I guess, really, about metabolic syndrome is that for a long time it has been sort of flying under the radar. At first glance, some of these criteria might be what people say, oh, just a touch off, just a little high. The blood sugar elevation is, may be high enough to indicate prediabetes, but not diabetes. The rise in blood pressure might be equal to what's called stage 1 hypertension, which is a risk, but somehow it often doesn't sound so bad. And the elevation in triglycerides is high enough that it does indicate risk, but it may not be high enough that it warrants medical care, medication for some people. So all of this can make it seem like, we just try to ignore it, but it's very important, and research is growing now to recognize that when these five conditions, or 3 out of the 5, come together, they do provide a cautionary sign about what an unhealthy body environment. And in particular, it is a concern both for overall health. The rates are rising, and we now have almost half of US adults meeting these criteria for metabolic syndrome. If you've heard of metabolic syndrome before, you've probably heard about it in connection with heart disease risk, which increases more than twofold in people with metabolic syndrome. The risk of type 2 diabetes is 4 times higher in people with metabolic syndrome. And one of the more recent learnings about the health risks of metabolic syndrome is that it can increase the risk of a certain type of liver disease that involves abnormal fat deposits in the liver that aren't due to excess alcohol consumption or other causes. Now, metabolic syndrome also has specific cancer-related links. People with metabolic syndrome are from 25 to 60% have greater risk for these 5 cancers that are listed here, and the risk of a more aggressive form of prostate cancer. And for people who have had cancer, after a cancer diagnosis, the presence of metabolic syndrome, whether it was existing before or is new, is associated with greater risk of post-surgical complications, cancer recurrence, and death from cancer. And unfortunately, some types of cancer treatment can increase the factors that are linked to metabolic syndrome. It's a side effect that's just occurs with certain treatments. So if we're going to talk about strategies to reduce the risk of metabolic syndrome or reverse it, first, let's get grounded by understanding what is actually behind its development. It involves inflammation, chronic low-grade inflammation, insulin resistance, and what's called a dysfunctional body fat. That's a fat that's not doing its job, and excess visceral fat. And we will look at that in more detail. When we talk about body fat, we need to recognize that there's 2 kinds of body fat. Subcutaneous fat is the fat that's right under the skin. As you can see in this diagram, it could be anywhere in your body, but just so you can see it here in the shade of brown. And when calorie consumption outpaces the calorie needs, eventually it can exceed the capacity for this subcutaneous fat to store it and to take up and store it. That's part of subcutaneous fat job, is this a storage. And when that fat storage capacity is exceeded, then what's called ectopic fat is deposited, and that is fat in tissues where it's not supposed to be, like in the liver, in the pancreas, in the heart, and in skeletal muscle. Remember, you talked last week with Dr. Berger about how when sarcopenia occurs, that it can involve more fat getting into muscle tissue. And visceral fat is the fat that builds up surrounding the heart or within the abdomen, invading, surrounding the gastrointestinal organs. And as this visceral fat deep in the abdomen expands, immune cells invade the fat tissue, surrounding the normal fat cells and secreting proteins called cytokines that promote inflammation. And inflammation in this microenvironment, the environment right around the fat cell, can stimulate a chronic low-grade inflammation throughout the whole body. Excess visceral fat also decreases levels of adiponectin, which is an anti-inflammatory hormone. And as blood circulates out of the visceral fat, it mostly travels directly to the liver. And there it triggers several changes in metabolism that result in increased levels of circulating insulin, increased production of the lipoproteins, the carriers for triglycerides, and continues production of glucose in the liver, sugar in the liver. So chronic inflammation increases the production. First, I should say, inflammation itself is a normal body process. All these things, just as body fat is a normal, healthy thing that we need, inflammation is a normal body process. If you had a cut or a wound, inflammation is the body process. For example, if you had a cut or hit your hand, hit a hammer on your hand, and you saw it get red, that is the body's inflammatory response to heal, calling the immune cells to come and resolve it. So that's a good thing. But chronic inflammation is a low-grade thing that goes on, and that is damaging. This inflammation increases the production of free radicals, which are highly reactive molecules that can interact with DNA and change gene expression and create what's called oxidative stress. Inflammation plus oxidative stress cause changes in insulin receptors on cells and trigger changes in signaling pathways within cells that sort of turn off or blunt insulin signaling so that the cells can't respond to insulin the way they normally would and lead to what's called insulin resistance. And we'll be coming back to that concept in just a minute. Inflammation also triggers cell signaling pathways and gene expression that can drive cancer cell growth and make cells more resistant to the normal process called apoptosis, which is the self-destruction of abnormal cells, which is part of our body's normal process of enhancing health. The inflammation can also enhance signaling by androgens and estrogen. And this inflammation can also lead to changes in blood vessels that make them more stiff. And that stiffness can raise blood pressure and make treatment for blood pressure, make blood pressure less responsive to medications aimed to treat it. Now, insulin resistance, insulin, you, I imagine, know, is a hormone that's made by the pancreas that helps glucose, blood sugar, to enter into muscle and fat and liver cells where it's used for energy. When blood sugar levels rise after you eat, the pancreas releases insulin into the blood, and then that insulin then lowers the blood sugar to keep that sugar in the normal range. Insulin resistance is when cells in your muscles, fat, and liver don't respond well to insulin and can't easily take up the sugar from your blood. So as a result, your pancreas keeps working, churning out more and more insulin, trying to keep those blood sugar levels normal. And as long as your pancreas can make enough insulin to overcome your cell's weak response to insulin, your blood sugar levels will stay in the healthy range. But these chronically elevated levels of insulin have some negative effects. Again, insulin, normal, healthy, important hormone, but elevated levels can trigger cell signaling pathways that drive cancer cell growth. They can promote inflammation. So you see how this is a little bit of a back and forth cycle where inflammation promotes insulin resistance, and insulin resistance in turn promotes inflammation. The insulin, these elevated levels of insulin can trigger the metabolic pathways that lead to increased levels of blood triglycerides, and they change the hormonal and nervous systems that raise blood pressure. So you see how all those things tie together, and the important message here as we move now to, so what do we do about it, is that there are a variety of factors that promote metabolic syndrome, and that gives us a variety of ways that we can tackle it to reduce the risk of developing it or to try to reduce or reverse it. So let's get started and looking at what that might look like. First, in terms of diet, we're looking at a plant-focused diet. More now, the evidence, whether it's in terms of cancer or diabetes or heart disease, is not focusing on what used to be called in a reductionist point of view, focusing on individual nutrients and compounds. It's looking at an overall dietary pattern. And so when we look at it, what would be called an anti-inflammatory diet, that's a foods rich in antioxidant nutrients and compounds that support the body's antioxidant defenses. Some nutrients are antioxidants themselves. They reduce those free radicals, but we have our own body system of enzymes and compounds that fight oxidative stress. But some of the compounds in our diet can actually promote those systems or support them. So that can involve compounds like carotenoids and polyphenols in fruits and vegetables and whole grains and other plant foods. And in fact, all of these nutrients, we're looking at this list of plant foods here. Coffee, tea, cocoa, extra virgin olive oil, and even some herbs and spices may also contribute to those antioxidant and anti-inflammatory defenses, although the bulk of our strategy needs to rely on these vegetables, fruits, whole grains, pulses, soy foods, nuts, and seeds. Second prong of our anti-inflammatory diet strategy is to have foods that support a health protective gut bacteria. Bacteria in the gut, you might have heard the gut microbiome. Bacteria in the gut use certain undigestible compounds to produce short chain fatty acids that actually protect the cells in the colon and seem to have anti-inflammatory effects both in the colon and throughout the body. So we want to think about what feeds a healthy gut microbiome. And you may see a lot of different information about this in the media, and unfortunately, most of it is not true. It's very theoretical. We have a lot more to learn about this than still. But we do know that there are some compounds, these are called prebiotics. The definition of a prebiotic is that it has to have an effect on the gut microbiomes, gut microbes, that has a clear health effect. And those, so the foods that contain those prebiotics include the onions, pulses, which are dried beans, dried peas, lentils, and chickpeas, and asparagus and artichokes. Now, foods with fermentable fiber, this is one type of dietary fiber, and we'll look at this in a little bit more, is we don't know for sure if they have a specific health effect, but we know that the bacteria can use this type of fiber to produce these short chain fatty acids that are seem to be protective. So those are foods that can be helpful. And a little bit less certain, but looking pretty good, are some of these plant compounds called polyphenols that I mentioned that support antioxidant defenses. Also seem to be substances we can't completely digest them, but the microbes in our gut can, and seem to form these short chain fatty acids from them. So when we talk about dietary fiber, the important thing to recognize is that it's not all the same. You can't just take one load of fiber and think you've got yourself covered. What we call insoluble or bulking types of dietary fiber are the types of, if this is a type of fiber that makes stools softer and easier to pass and helps avoid constipation. What we call viscous type fiber is acts like a sponge in the colon. It helps to lower blood cholesterol levels, and it slows the blood sugar rise after eating, which seems to then help to reduce insulin resistance. And a third type of fiber is called fermentable fiber. That's the fiber we were just talking about that can nurture gut microbes. So what are we talking about for an actual diet that addresses this? Here are some basic targets. First of all, for vegetables and fruits, first thing to do is to be trying to get 2.5 cups a day. The biggest difference in health, whether it is in terms of cancer, in terms of heart disease, and so forth, is between people who can reach that 2.5 cups, or what used to be called 5 a day, because it's 5 half cups, and people who have very low levels of consumption. Once you can get there, then if you can, depending on your calorie needs, is how much room you have, aim for 2 to 4 cups a day of vegetables and 1.5 to 2.5 cups per day of fruits. Whole grains are really important, and they provide a whole lot more than just dietary fiber. They also provide a range of nutrients and protective plant compounds. So the basic health recommendation as a starting point is that at least half of the grain products you eat should be whole grains rather than refined grains. And as you can get more, that is even better. And legumes, which includes soy foods, as well as the pulses, which are the dried beans, peas, chickpeas, and lentils. We don't have any specific cancer-related target amount, but a half cup 3 times a week is the recommendation for overall health. And there's pretty good evidence that including more can be even better. And altogether, these foods will add up to help meet the goal, which is recommended, of dietary fiber of 30 grams a day from food sources. And if you want to see if that's really possible, considering that the average American eats only 16 to 17 grams a day, here's what it looks like. If we got those 4 to 8 half-cup servings of vegetables, that would supply 8 to 16 grams. You see how the 3 to 4 half-cups of fruit add up, whole grains. So you can include some refined grains if you want to. It's just not going to be as much fiber or protective phytochemicals. And right there, that gets you in the range of 21 to 41 grams. Then on any given day, if you're including some of those dried beans or peas, the pulses, if a particular cereal that you eat is even higher than a whole grain in fiber, or if you're including some nuts or seeds or flaxseed, then you can see how the total gets right up there. So it's a matter of including these foods in meals throughout the day. The average American, we get kind of most of it all in one meal, and that's just we're never going to reach those targets if that's what we do. Now, some of you may be wondering about added sugars, and that does indeed play into insulin resistance. And the recommendation for overall health is to get no more than 10% of your calories from added sugars. Now, this is not the natural sugar in fruit. We're talking about added sugars here. But actually, when you look at, and you may start getting a hint of it when we looked at how the food groups add up in those plant foods we were just looking at, there's actually not a whole lot of room that if you're following a healthy dietary pattern, you probably don't have room unless your calorie needs are super high. And for some people, they may be either due to illness or because they're incredibly active athletically. But to give you a rough idea, when you see added sugars on food labels, depending on your calorie needs, 5 to 10% of calories would be these numbers as you see them here. And so it's not that you need to completely give up sweets, but it does add up. It adds up in terms of extra calories and taking out space for the health promoting foods. And it also can lead to, when it's a large amount, can lead to calls for excess insulin if those blood sugar levels keep rising. So if you're going to have sweets, just have them with a meal, have a small part with something else, and try to not feel guilty about them, because when you get emotionally hooked on them, that's when it's hard to avoid eating too much. Now, another component of that dietary pattern to fight insulin, to fight metabolic syndrome is watching sodium. And it's not about the salt shaker, actually. The majority of the American sodium intake comes from not from what you add at the table or in cooking, but from what's added to foods before they ever get to you. The goal is to reduce sodium intake to no more than 2,300 milligrams a day. Even lower would produce an even greater decrease in blood pressure, but it gets a little trickier. But the key point is that reducing sodium by even 1,000 milligrams a day, if you're one of those people who, the most Americans who are consuming too much salt, even reducing sodium by, say, 1,000 milligrams a day can decrease blood pressure by 3 or 4 millimeters of mercury, 3 or 4 points if you have hypertension, and 1 or 3 points if you don't have hypertension, just helping to keep it low. And the way you could accomplish that is just look for some swaps, some tweaks you can make with food that would each cut about 250 milligrams. 4 of those, you can see you get 1,000 milligrams. And that is that's a workable target that you could be looking for. What would that look like? Well, if you're using processed mixes for your rice or pasta or things like that, they'll easily have 500 to 1,000 milligrams of sodium in 1 cup as it's prepared. Not from your adding salt, because of what's already in there. So if you start with a plain grain and add your own herbs and spices and seasoning, even if you add a touch of salt, you won't add as much as what's in those mixes. If you get canned vegetables, getting them instead either frozen or with no salt added in the can, or you can reduce that substantially. The same is true for dry canned beans, black beans, chickpeas, kidney beans, and so forth. Either get them canned without salt, or if you can only find them in the regular way, pour them in a sieve, a strainer, and rinse them a little bit, and you'll cut the sodium substantially. So by making some of these simple swaps, it actually is pretty easy for most people to find where they've got 250 milligrams extra in several different foods a day, and that would cut 1,000 milligrams a day. But keep in mind that a dietary pattern to reduce blood pressure is not only based on sodium alone. That's putting all your eggs in one basket and is not effective. Actually, this healthy plant-focused dietary pattern that we were talking about is a tremendous asset because these foods that we were looking at in terms of anti-inflammatory and antioxidant components and support actually contain potassium and magnesium that help to control blood pressure. Those same polyphenols that we looked at in terms of being anti-inflammatory and supporting a healthy gut microbiome also can tend to help reduce blood pressure. And foods with dietary fiber, either the viscous or the fermentable types, also help. Other components of an overall lifestyle to reduce blood pressure include limiting alcohol, being physically active. For blood pressure, especially aerobic exercise, but even strength training exercise does have some benefit. And weight, because this excess visceral fat is part of what can raise blood pressure. After a cancer diagnosis, you really want to talk this over with a healthcare provider as far as what would be appropriate for you as an individual. Because of course, the concern is, as you heard from Dr. Berger last week, that if while you're losing weight, you're also losing lean body mass, losing lean muscle. That's not a good thing. And so it needs to be very carefully thought out as to what's right for you. Another strategy in terms of reducing metabolic syndrome is watching alcohol. Some people think of alcohol, but what, isn't that heart healthy? But actually amounts beyond moderation increase blood pressure and can raise triglycerides. So depending on what your blood pressure is and how much you're drinking, it can be quite an effective way to reduce both of those two components of metabolic syndrome. Some people use alcohol like a nightcap. They have trouble sleeping and they think that's going to be helpful. But actually alcohol, if that's you, it can help people get to sleep, but it tends to cause a very poor quality sleep. So it's actually not a sleep aid at all. And if you think, well, as long as you drink red wine, you're okay. No, actually, the effect, the risks come from the alcohol content itself, and it's the same whether it's red wine, white wine, beer, or spirits. So the thing is, if you've got alcohol beyond recommended amounts, then think about what else you can do, either alternative beverages, or if it's your way to unwind, if it's your way to socialize, whatever it is, there are other alternatives, and that would be the way to try and work it out. For lowest cancer risk and better overall health, the recommendation is to limit alcohol to no more than 1 standard drink a day for women, no more than 2 a day for men. And note that that is based on the actual alcohol content. So 1 larger glass, if it counts, if it has, double the amount of alcohol is what you see here, then that's 2 drinks. That's not 1 drink. Now, I want to circle back to how all this fits with your conversations about protein last week and muscle mass. I think the numbers got a little confusing perhaps last week, I heard, so I've laid this out as clearly as I can for you. The recommended dietary allowance, which is a recommendation that covers the needs of virtually all healthy adults. It's not a minimum target. It's meant to be a range that would cover almost everyone's needs who is healthy, is 0.8 grams of protein per kilo. And I know most of us aren't used to thinking in terms of kilograms. 2.2 kilograms is 2.2 pounds is 1 kilogram. So I've done the math for you. That's 0.36 grams of protein per pound of body weight. Now, again, that's for typical healthy adults. That's the RDA. There are some research is now showing that there are some people who may benefit from protein above the RDA. People age 70 and older seem to have a greater need for protein, and you see that listed here. Athletes, depending on the sport, the intensity, this doesn't refer to the person who goes out for a walk on the weekends. We're talking about, serious athletes, depending on their sport and the intensity with which they're training and what their goals are, will need more, as you see here, and pertinent to all of you for medical conditions like cancer. Big point here. There is no one recommendation for somebody who has had cancer. It is very individual, depending on your age, the type of cancer, the type of treatment, and what your protein stores were, going into this. For someone who's come in kind of malnourished after a lot of weight loss or malabsorption and things like that, their needs may be higher. For other people who are coming in not so depleted, then the needs aren't so high. But the typical recommendation that an oncology dietitian would use for someone with cancer would range between 1.2 and 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight, which would be 0.55 to 0.7 grams per pound. If someone is really depleted or has reasons for significantly higher needs, it might go up to 2 grams per kilo, which is 0.9 grams per pound. And you see some examples here of how that would look, which could range from anywhere from 72 grams a day, not much higher, but higher than a healthy adult would aim for, all the way up to, at a higher weight and a higher need, 133 grams a day. That's significantly higher. The important point, again, I want to emphasize, I cannot give you a specific number that's right for you, that needs to be assessed by your registered dietitian, nutritionist, or healthcare team. Couple considerations and misunderstandings, 5 key points I want you to take away about protein. First, more is not always better. You can't specifically eat protein and think you're going to absolutely send it straight to your immune system or straight to your muscles. Meeting your protein needs is important, but once you get beyond that, it's not doing anything extra for you. Protein is necessary for building and maintaining muscle, but you can't do it alone. You can't just boost protein and have that think you're going to preserve or increase your muscles. You have to have adequate calories and nutrients. If you're short on calories, some of that protein is going to get burned for energy, not going straight to building lean muscle tissue. You also need to be doing strength training exercise and all of the components that we've talked about tonight that help to reduce inflammation and reduce insulin resistance actually help to ensure that that protein you're consuming is going to build lean body mass. Again, if you're extra protein, it just gets treated as extra calories. So for some people, thinking that they're helping to secure lean body mass, if they're getting more than they need, they could actually be consuming extra calories, that if that's leading them to gain weight, then that is counterproductive here. You may hear concerns about what's called complete protein. Protein is made up of amino acids, some of which our body cannot make, and so we need to get them in our food. And traditionally, we think of animal proteins like meat, poultry, fish, and dairy products as complete protein and think, oh, we've got to have that. That is not true. Actually, some plant foods, as you see listed here, have complete protein, but we don't need to consume our protein all as complete protein. We can make our own complete protein from the different amino acids that we get from a variety of different plant foods. So the worry that you must focus on these high quality or complete proteins is no longer supported by research. And we also see that you don't need to have extra protein if you're getting most of your protein from plants, because again, that has been proven not to be something needed. Just as a quick shot, and you'll be able to go back and look at this in more detail, you see that certainly the animal protein foods tend to be very concentrated in protein, but by the time you add up all those fiber-rich, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, nutrient-rich, fiber-rich foods, you also are getting a significant amount of protein from plant foods. If you're choosing not to eat animal foods, or if you're specifically limiting them, then it is important that you look at some of these higher protein choices like pulses and soy foods and how much of other sources of protein you're getting in order to meet those needs that we talked about. Couple more quick points. Physical activity is really important, as you heard last week. Even with, so often people think physical activity is for weight loss, and it certainly isn't. Regardless of what happens with your weight, physical activity helps to reduce insulin resistance, reduce blood pressure, support your immune system, help your GI tract keep functioning, and support your stress management and psychological health. So work on finding ways that will work for you. And in particular, after a cancer diagnosis, you want to get individualized advice from your healthcare provider about the physical activity that's right for you, considering your bone health and balance and any nerve damage or lymphedema. All of those things can go into evaluating what amount and types of exercise are right for you. So how do we tie all this together? First, I want to be very clear that although we've talked about body fat tonight and body composition, if you hear about BMI, body mass index, or weight itself, that is not, metabolic syndrome is not defined by that because all weight is not the same. You heard last week about the importance of muscle tissue and that at the same weight, people can have different amounts of lean body mass. In the same way, at the same weight, or same BMI, people can have different amounts of body fat, and it can be in different places, either visceral fat, unhealthy fat, or subcutaneous fat, which does not pose health risks. So pulling all together, what are we saying about how we can address metabolic syndrome? We want to focus around nutrient-rich plant foods. We want to limit both sodium and added sugars, but it doesn't mean zero added sugars, and it doesn't mean a sodium-free diet or anything like that. Limiting alcohol, include a variety of foods with protein that will meet your individual needs and make sure that you're matching your calories to your needs, avoiding excess so that you're not contributing to that unhealthy types of body fat, but also making sure you're consuming enough calories so that you can, the protein that you consume is being used to support your lean body mass. You want to keep physically active in ways that are right for you, both strength training and aerobic exercise, and embracing a overall health supportive lifestyle with sleep and stress reduction and the importance of community, friends and loved ones to support you. We do have evidence that when we have a high quality diet that measures all of these components we've talked about, that is associated among cancer survivors with lower deaths, both from all causes and from cancer. And when we put that all together with a healthy lifestyle among people who have developed cancer, following them for many years, the healthier the lifestyle from including physical activity and diet and alcohol and sleep duration, there is lower risk of developing heart disease, which is for many cancers, actually one of the outcomes of great concern. I want to just close by talking about the fact that you're encountering, I'm sure, all kinds of headline hype and confusion. Be really careful about what you see. And in fact, my recommendation is simply to recognize that all the information, all the headlines that come across your eyes in the media, on social media, or in your email is not equal. Base the recommendations, base your choices on recommendations from recognized authorities like the American Institute for Cancer Research, the American Cancer Society, and other experts, not on single studies or hearsay. And I've got some resources here that will be in your library as well as here. And with that, I just will say thank you, and I'm excited to take your questions.